It was 51 years ago. A baby girl vanished from her home in Fort Worth, Texas, taken by a stranger wearing white gloves on a blistering summer morning. There were no witnesses, no ransom note, no clues, only a mother's scream echoing through the walls of an empty apartment. Decades passed, detectives retired, and the case turned cold. But one family refused to give up. Then, in the fall of 2022, an unexpected message appeared. A single line of text that would rewrite everything they thought they knew. DNA match found. What followed was one of the most unbelievable reunions in American history. A story where science met faith and hope refused to die. Before we dive into this unbelievable true story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if stories of mystery, resilience, and miracles move you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The summer of 1971 in Fort Worth, Texas, a city pulsing with growth and grit. Back then, working-class families chased the American dream one paycheck at a time, their hopes as fragile as the scorching Texas heat. Among them was Alta Pantenko, a 22-year-old single mother trying to hold her world together after separating from her husband, Jeffrey Highsmith. Alta worked long double shifts at a small diner just to afford rent for a modest apartment she shared with a roommate. Her pride was her little girl, 21-month-old Melissa, a child with bright eyes and a laugh that could melt the hardest heart. But behind that smile, Alta was exhausted and cornered. Affordable childcare was nearly impossible to find, and reliable babysitters were even rarer. Desperate for help, Alta did what many young mothers did in those days. She placed a simple classified ad in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. It was short, practical, and hopeful. Responsible babysitter needed for weekday care. Just another small act in a busy mother's life. What she didn't know was that this ordinary ad would spark one of the longest missing child mysteries in American history. A few days later, the phone rang. The woman on the line introduced herself as Ruth Johnson. Her voice was calm, polite, and confident, the kind that instantly put people at ease. Ruth said she'd cared for children for years and lived in a comfortable house with a big yard. Everything about her sounded right. Professional, warm, trustworthy. They planned to meet at Alta's workplace, but on the day of the meeting, Ruth never showed. Instead, she called again, apologizing sweetly and promising she was still eager for the job. Her persistence, that steady, soothing tone, wore down Alta's hesitation. With no family nearby and her work schedule closing in, Alta made what felt like a reasonable decision. She hired the woman over the phone. On the morning of August 23, 1971, Alta left early for work, leaving instructions for Bauern, her roommate, to hand Melissa over to the new babysitter later that morning. Around 9 o'clock, a woman arrived at the Spanish Gate Apartments on East Seminary Drive. She looked just as Alta had described, polite, composed, neatly dressed. But there was something off. It was over 100 degrees outside, yet the woman wore long white gloves, a scarf around her neck, and a bonnet that hid most of her hair and face. Her outfit wasn't meant for comfort. It was meant for concealment. Still, nothing in her demeanor hinted at danger. She spoke softly, smiled kindly, introduced herself as Ruth Johnson, and accepted the baby with quiet confidence. The roommate handed over little Melissa along with a small diaper bag, a change of clothes, a bottle, a few essentials, and watched as the woman walked away, cradling the child in her arms. She never came back. That evening, Alta returned home expecting to hear her daughter's giggles, the rustle of toys, the hum of home. Instead, there was silence. Melissa's crib was empty, her bottle untouched, her toys waiting, as if time itself had stopped. At first, Alta told herself there had been a misunderstanding. Maybe the babysitter had taken Melissa for a walk. Maybe she'd gone to her house nearby. But hours passed, and no one came back. Phone calls led nowhere. Neighbors hadn't seen a thing. By nightfall, Fear turned to panic. Around 8 that evening, Alta called the Fort Worth Police Department to report her baby missing. Officers arrived, took statements, and began their search. But what they uncovered only deepened the mystery. There was no record of any Ruth Johnson. Not in employment listings, not in housing databases, not anywhere. The name was as empty as the crib Alta stared at that night. The only clue they had came from the roommate's description. A woman dressed too neatly for a blistering Texas day, wearing gloves and scarves that seemed meant not to impress, but to hide. In 1971, forensic science was still in its infancy. There were no DNA tests, no cell towers to ping, no digital footprints to trace. But even the simplest reasoning told detectives one thing: the woman's clothing hadn't been random. Those white gloves weren't for style, they were to erase fingerprints. The scarf and bonnet weren't about modesty. They were meant to hide who she was. What had seemed like eccentric fashion now looked like premeditation. Every detail of her appearance suggested a plan designed to vanish without a trace. Detectives fanned out across Fort Worth, canvassing every corner of East Seminary Drive. They knocked on doors, questioned neighbors, and interviewed store clerks. Not one person remembered seeing a woman walking with a toddler that morning. No one had noticed a car idling nearby. No buses had reported a passenger matching her description. The city had simply swallowed her whole. Police checked hospitals, train stations, and every cab company in Tarrant County. They even searched the wooded lots and drainage ditches along the freeway, hoping for some clue, a scrap of fabric, a baby's shoe, anything. But the city gave them nothing. No clothing, no stroller, no vehicle. It was as if the woman and child had walked off the map. By the second day, the FBI joined the case, officially classifying it as a likely kidnapping under interstate abduction laws. Flyers featuring Melissa's cherubic face spread across Texas and neighboring states. Newspapers printed the headline, "Missing from Fort Worth," beside a photo of the little girl with a ribbon in her hair. Still, investigators were trapped by the limits of their era. There were no surveillance cameras watching over apartment complexes, no databases storing phone records. The woman calling herself Ruth Johnson had likely used a payphone, anonymous and untraceable. Every clue relied on human memory, and human memory fades fast. Detectives questioned Alta again and again, searching for inconsistencies. Her recent separation from Jeffrey drew suspicion, as it often did in child disappearance cases. But both parents were cleared early. There were no custody battles, no history of neglect, no reason to believe anyone in the family had been involved. In the days that followed, the community rallied. Volunteers formed search parties that combed through vacant lots, parks, and backyards. Local churches held vigils, candles flickering against the August night. On television, Alta appeared trembling and tearful, pleading for her daughter's safe return. Yet not a single credible witness came forward. Weeks turned into months, and the silence grew heavier. Investigators exhausted every lead. The mysterious babysitter remained nothing more than a ghost, Ruth Johnson, a name that had never existed. In police reports, she became known simply as the woman in white gloves. Inside the department, frustration simmered. Detectives admitted quietly that the case had no foundation to build on. No witnesses, no vehicle, no scene of the crime. The abduction had been terrifyingly simple. A woman arrived. A child disappeared. And that was it. For Alta, life stopped moving. She quit her job and poured every waking moment into the search. Her days were spent answering calls, retracing steps, chasing whispers of sightings that always led nowhere. At night, she replayed every second of that phone call. The soft tone, the practiced words, a large yard, experienced babysitter. Over and over, she asked herself the same unbearable question. How could I have trusted her? When police officially shifted the case into the Missing Persons Division, it wasn't closure, it was surrender. The file stayed open but silent, waiting for a miracle that never came. As the years passed, Melissa's picture, a little girl with bright eyes and a bow in her hair, moved from front pages to file cabinets. But the memory of that day never faded for her mother. A blistering August morning, a polite stranger, a decision that seemed harmless, until it wasn't. Because the woman in white gloves hadn't just taken a child. She had taken certainty, leaving behind questions that no one could answer. The woman in white gloves hadn't just stolen a child. She had stolen certainty, leaving behind questions that time refused to answer. By the end of 1971, the name Melissa Highsmith joined a heartbreaking roll call, a growing list of missing children across America. It was a list that spoke to the innocence of an era and the limits of its investigations. But Melissa's case stood apart for one haunting reason. It didn't begin with violence or chaos. It began with trust, the kind every parent must place in the world just to survive. And that trust, once broken, vanished as completely as the woman herself. When the investigation first began that August, Fort Worth police were confident. In most child abductions, the critical window was 48 hours. If no trace appeared by then, hope began to fade. But in Melissa's case, those hours stretched into weeks, then months, then decades. Despite the combined efforts of the Fort Worth Police Department and the FBI, the case went cold almost as soon as it began. There was no ransom note, no sign of forced entry, no connection to known kidnapping rings, nothing to suggest foul play. And yet, every instinct told investigators it had been carefully planned. The problem was, their suspect didn't exist. Ruth Johnson was a name written on air. As weeks turned into winter, suspicion turned inward. Investigators, following standard procedure, scrutinized Alta Apantenko herself. A young mother, recently separated, working long hours. She fit too neatly into the FBI's checklist of possible family-related disappearances. But after endless interviews and alibis that held strong, Alta was cleared. What remained was only her heartbreak. Her days became an endless loop of interrogation and waiting. Her nights, a private cross-examination of her own soul. She'd sit beside Melissa's photo, that sweet face frozen in time, and replay the same morning again and again. The newspaper ad, the voice on the phone, the words "large yard" and "experienced babysitter." She searched for the mistake she could never undo. The FBI kept Melissa's case open under the Federal Kidnapping Act, but without evidence she had crossed state lines, their hands were tied. By the mid-70s, new cases arrived daily, and Melissa's file was quietly pushed into the archives. One more folder in a sea of the missing. But the Highsmith family never stopped. Not for a day. Alta and Jeffrey built separate lives over time, yet they remained bound by the same hollow absence. Every rumor, every phone call, every whispered story of a little girl who looked like Melissa reignited that fragile hope and that unbearable ache. They learned to live inside that contradiction. Hope as lifeline, hope as punishment. When the 80s and 90s arrived, a new wave of technology rekindled faint optimism. The rise of age progression sketches and computerized photo enhancement gave families like the Highsmiths a new kind of tool, a way to imagine what their missing children might look like years later. Alta submitted Melissa's photos to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and soon, digital renderings of an older Melissa began appearing in pamphlets, news stories, even TV segments. Each release brought a flood of new tips, and every tip ended the same way. A woman in Oklahoma swore her neighbor looked just like the picture. A truck driver in New Mexico said he'd given a ride to a young woman with the same bright eyes. Alta and Jeffrey followed every one. They drove across states, hearts pounding, only to face the same bitter truth. It wasn't her. By the late 90s, DNA testing began entering the picture, a breakthrough that promised certainty where faith had failed. The family submitted their samples to every available lab, hoping for a match that never came. Back then, the technology was slow and scattered. The databases were incomplete. Each result came back with the same devastating words: No match found. Still, Alta refused to accept the word closure. She said it felt like another kind of loss, one she wasn't ready to bear. Public interest eventually faded. Newsrooms stopped calling. For Fort Worth police, the case became one of more than 1,000 cold files buried in metal cabinets. At one point, the department had a single detective handling all of them, an impossible task that left most cases, including Melissa's, frozen in time. But for the family, time never froze. It just kept moving, one slow, painful year at a time. By the early 2000s, the world had changed, and with it, the way people searched for truth. The Highsmith family, once bound to phone calls, flyers, and dead ends, turned to a new kind of hope, the internet. In the year 2000, Melissa's siblings, who had grown up on their parents' stories of loss and longing, created a small digital beacon called Finding Melissa Highsmith. It started as a simple Facebook page, a place to collect old photographs, yellowed newspaper clippings, and age-progressed renderings of what their sister might look like now. But it quickly became more than that, a living archive, a call for help echoing into the digital void. The page caught the attention of local communities and missing person advocates across the country. Amateur sleuths, retired detectives, even genealogy hobbyists joined the search, drawn by the mystery that had haunted Fort Worth since 1971. Online forums like Web Sleuths dissected every detail of the case, the gloves, the scarf, the unbearable silence that followed. But despite the renewed attention, the trail stayed cold. Every few years, a flicker of hope would reappear, a new sketch, a mistaken resemblance, a woman convinced she might be Melissa. Each time, DNA testing offered the promise of answers. Each time, the result was the same. No match. For Alta, these false alarms were both salvation and heartbreak. She learned to read lab reports like weather forecasts, clinically, but never without hope. Every time the phone rang, her heart lifted. Maybe this is it, she would whisper to herself. And almost every time, it wasn't. As the years went on, the public began to question how a case so personal, so visible, could remain frozen in time. Local newspapers ran editorials criticizing the Fort Worth Police Department, pointing to the city's lack of resources and mounting backlog of cold cases. Activists demanded funding for dedicated investigators. A police spokesperson admitted what families like the Highsmiths already knew too well. With one detective handling over 1,000 cases, we just can't give each one the attention it deserves. And yet, through that bureaucratic stillness, the Highsmiths' persistence became something extraordinary. Their quiet endurance, their refusal to give up, turned the story into a kind of legend within the missing persons community. Every year, on Melissa's birthday, the family gathered. Just a small cake, a few candles, a whispered promise, "We'll bring you home." Neighbors would see Alta by her window each November, lighting a single candle against the dark. When asked why she still did it after all these years, her answer was always the same. Because I haven't seen her, and until I do, she's not gone. As time passed, the weight of the search shifted to the next generation. Melissa's brothers and sisters, now adults with families of their own, took up the mission. They learned how to navigate online archives, request public records, and contact genetic testing companies. They became, in their own way, detectives, driven not by training, but by love. Still, as the decades slipped by, the odds of a living resolution grew smaller. Most missing child cases from the 70s had long since faded into speculation. Some believed the woman who had taken Melissa was dead, her secret buried with her. But the Highsmith family rejected that kind of surrender. They believed in science and in faith. When genetic genealogy began making headlines for solving decades-old cold cases, it felt like a light flickering at the end of a long, dark tunnel. The family began to study it, to learn how DNA could do what detectives never could: trace bloodlines, connect generations, bridge time. Through it all, Alta aged quietly, her hands lined, her hair silver, her voice calm. 50 years of waiting had etched their mark, but her belief never wavered. When asked how she could still hold on after so long, she gave an answer that silenced everyone who heard it. "Believing isn't something I choose," she said softly. "It's how I survive. If I stop believing she's alive, then I lose her twice." By the time Fort Worth had modernized, its skyline rising, its archives digitized, Melissa's picture still hung inside the police department. A toddler in a white dress, frozen in 1971, still smiling from behind the glass. By 2020, detectives had reopened the file more than once, each time hoping technology could do what manpower couldn't. But every review ended the same way. No new evidence, no new leads. For the police, it had become a procedural failure, one of the longest unresolved abductions in Texas history. But for the Highsmiths, it was something deeper, a measure of faith that had outlasted logic. Half a century after that August morning, the world looked nothing like it once had. Phones were now cameras. Databases spanned continents. Secrets could hide only so long. And yet one question still lingered, echoing across time. Where is Melissa? When the answer finally began to take shape, it didn't come from a detective's report or a forgotten case file. It came from something smaller, something no one in 1971 could have imagined. A strand of DNA, uploaded to a website by a father who never stopped searching. By early 2022, the disappearance of Melissa Highsmith had become more than just a cold case. It was a piece of living American history, one of the oldest unresolved abductions in the country, half a century old and still echoing through a single family's life. For most families, time eventually buries grief. Names fade, faces blur, and memories become stories told around kitchen tables. But not for the Highsmiths. Their search had survived generations. Their digital footprint, carefully built over the years, kept Melissa's name alive long after the headlines stopped printing it. Then, out of nowhere, something stirred. In September of 2022, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children received an anonymous call from Charleston, South Carolina. The caller claimed to have seen a woman who looked remarkably like one of the age-progressed images of Melissa that had circulated online. The description sounded convincing. A woman in her early 50s with facial features strikingly similar to the digital reconstruction created years before. When the tip reached the Fort Worth authorities, it was immediately shared with the Highsmith family. For Alta's surviving children, now grown with families of their own, this felt different. "We've heard 1,000 rumors," one sibling told reporters later. But this one felt real. Within days, they emptied savings accounts, booked flights, and flew to South Carolina. When they landed, they carried with them the same hope their parents once had. The hope that after 51 years, maybe this time, the waiting would end. They walked the streets of Charleston, handing out flyers, one showing Melissa as a baby, the other as the woman she might have become. Local news stations caught wind of their story, turning the family's arrival into a small media storm. The headline read, "Could missing Fort Worth girl be living in Charleston?" But the hope that burned so bright didn't last long. Within a week, DNA testing shattered the illusion. The woman wasn't Melissa. Once again, the Highsmith family found themselves standing on the edge of heartbreak. It was another rise and fall, another cycle of hope and loss. Something they had endured so many times that grief itself had become routine. Yet this disappointment left behind something unexpected. The trip to South Carolina reminded them of something they hadn't felt in years: momentum. The world had changed. Technology had evolved beyond what investigators in 1971 could have imagined. Police work had limits, but science, they realized, had no boundaries left. Back home in Texas, Jeffrey Highsmith, Melissa's father, began to wonder if the answer might lie not in case files or memory, but in blood. in the strands of DNA that carried the truth of his daughter's existence. He started reading about consumer DNA kits, services like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA, tools that allowed ordinary people to trace family connections through genetics. The family had heard of them before, but never believed they could help. In their minds, DNA testing was a thing for detectives and government labs, not for broken families searching for lost children. But after that false lead in Charleston, a family friend, an amateur genealogist, said something that changed everything. "You've tried everything else," she told Jeffrey gently. "Why not this?" It was a simple process. A saliva sample mailed off to a lab, run through algorithms that compared his genetic code to millions of profiles worldwide. The odds were small, but not zero. And after 51 years, even a 1% chance felt like hope. For the Highsmiths, even a 1% chance was enough. After 51 years, they had learned to live on fragments of hope. And now, for the first time, hope had a new shape. A vial of saliva sealed inside a lab envelope. On November 22, 2022, just 3 weeks after Jeffrey submitted his DNA sample, an email appeared in his inbox. It looked ordinary, another routine update from the testing company. He almost deleted it, but something made him open it. The subject line read, "DNA match found, direct parental relation." At first, he thought it was an error. Maybe an ancestry result, a distant cousin, something minor. But when he opened the report, the words on the screen stopped him cold. 3 matches found. Direct genetic relation, 100% consistent with grandparent-grandchild connection. He stared at the message for a long time, barely breathing. Then he called one of his daughters, the one who managed the Finding Melissa Highsmith campaign online. Together, they combed through the data line by line, reading and rereading the names associated with the match. Slowly, a stunning realization began to take shape. Whoever those 3 people were, their mother had to be Melissa. The family reached out to 23andMe for help, explaining their situation and begging for guidance on how to confirm the connection. Privacy rules limited what the company could reveal, but they were able to send a message to the account owner linked to those profiles, a digital note reaching out across half a century of silence. While they waited for a response, Jeffrey connected with Lisa Jo Sheely, a clinical laboratory scientist and skilled genetic genealogist who volunteered to analyze the data. After reviewing the results, her conclusion was absolute. "There's no mistake," she told them. "The probability that these individuals are unrelated to Jeffrey is effectively 0. Her analysis revealed something no one expected. The genetic trail didn't lead to another state or another country, but right back to Fort Worth, Texas. 51 years of searching, and she had been there all along. Jeffrey would later say, "We searched the world for her, and she was right here in the same city." It was almost too much to comprehend. For decades, they'd followed every rumor, every false lead across the country, only to learn the truth had been waiting within driving distance. But before they could let themselves believe it, they needed to find the woman behind the data, the one whose DNA connected their past and present. Using public records, social media, and careful research, Sheely and the family traced the account to a woman named Melanie Walden. Her birth date matched Melissa's almost exactly. She had 3 adult children, the same 3 who appeared in the database. Everything aligned. Still, the Highsmiths were cautious. They had been burned too many times before, so Jeffrey decided to reach out himself. Through Facebook Messenger, he wrote a simple, trembling message. "Hi, my name is Jeffrey Highsmith. I believe I may be your biological father. I've been searching for my daughter, Melissa, for 51 years. On the other side of that message, Melanie froze. To her, it sounded absurd. The kind of thing that happens in scams, not real life. She ignored it. Days passed. Then her husband, curious about the strange message, typed Melissa Highsmith into Google. The first thing that appeared was the Finding Melissa Highsmith Facebook page, filled with photos, newspaper scans, and videos. He scrolled until one photo stopped him cold. A baby in a white dress smiling for the camera. The face, the eyes, the tiny birthmark near the left eye. It was her. He called his wife over silently. "Look," he said, showing her the photo. She stared for a long time. The resemblance was undeniable. Her birth year, her features, even the small mark near her eye, it all matched. Something inside her began to shift from disbelief to recognition. Meanwhile, back in Texas, Jeffrey and his family waited, hearts pounding every time the phone buzzed. Then, late one night, a notification appeared on the screen. "Melanie Walden has replied to your message." Her response was cautious but open. She said she'd seen the photos, and she couldn't deny what she felt. She agreed to speak with them and consider DNA testing to know the truth. The Highsmiths were overwhelmed, hopeful, terrified, and trying not to let their hearts run ahead of the science. They arranged for independent lab testing, determined to confirm everything before speaking publicly. At that point, no one outside the family knew. Not the police, not the press. After 51 years of begging for answers on camera, the biggest breakthrough in one of America's longest missing child cases was unfolding quietly, between two strangers exchanging messages on social media. Jeffrey would later admit, "I didn't know what to believe." But the science didn't lie. For the first time, there was something real. Not a rumor, not a sighting. Proof. By late November 2022, the family prepared for what they had waited half a century to do, to meet the woman they believed was Melissa. But before they could take that step, they wanted one more confirmation. This time, from a certified genetics laboratory, a final test to remove any doubt. And as they waited for those results, a quiet realization sank in. After 51 years of heartbreak, a trail of lies, and endless searching, the truth had found them. The waiting felt endless. Each day crawled by like an eternity as the Highsmith family held their breath for the final lab results. For Alta, now in her 70s, time had already taught her how to wait. But this was different. When her children told her about the possible DNA match, she didn't cry, didn't celebrate. She just looked down, folded her hands, and said softly, "I've had my hopes raised before. If it's true, I'll know when I see her." After half a century of heartbreak, she had learned to protect her hope the way others protect their hearts. Then, just before Thanksgiving, one of the most family-centered holidays in America, the phone rang. The voice on the other end trembled. The results were in. A perfect match. The DNA confirmed what had once felt impossible. The baby who vanished in 1971 was alive. Her name, her life, her story, all still unfolding. For the Highsmiths, the impossible had already happened. 51 years of silence had broken with a single truth. Melissa was home. What stunned them most wasn't how far they had gone to find her, but how close she had been all along. The answer they had chased across states, across decades, had been waiting just miles from where it all began. The discovery gave the family something they hadn't felt in decades: certainty. But even certainty needed proof strong enough to outlive doubt. That's when Lisa Jo Schill, the clinical scientist and genetic genealogist who had guided them, stepped in again. She ran the DNA through every test she could access, cross-checking it against public registries, running genetic markers, building family trees from raw data. The results told a story no one could dispute. 3 adults in Fort Worth shared a direct, first-degree connection to Jeffrey Highsmith. The genetic pattern fit one configuration only. They were his grandchildren. Tracing that line backward, Sheely followed the trail to a woman named Melanie Walden, born in 1970, the same year as Melissa Suzanne Highsmith. The coincidences began to stack up. She lived in Fort Worth. She was in her early 50s. Her birth records were incomplete. No listed hospital, no formal certificate until years after 1971. And then came the detail that ended all doubt. In old photos posted online, Sheila spotted a tiny birthmark beneath Melanie's left eye, the same one visible in baby Melissa's pictures from half a century earlier. That was the moment it changed, Sheila would later say. There's no algorithm for that. It's visual truth. With everything pointing toward the impossible, Jeffrey composed a new message. This one shorter, more direct, but filled with decades of emotion behind each word. My name is Jeffrey Highsmith. I believe you might be my daughter. I've been searching for Melissa for 51 years. When Melanie opened the message, she frowned. It had to be a scam. She'd lived her whole life in Fort Worth, attended local schools, had a family of her own. No one had ever hinted that her beginnings were anything unusual. She showed the message to her husband, half amused, half annoyed. People will say anything online, she said. But her husband was curious. He typed Melissa Highsmith into Facebook and found the page that had been running for more than 2 decades. Finding Melissa Highsmith. There it was. Decades of posts, photos, newspaper clippings, and pleas. And then, one image froze him in place. A baby in a white dress, smiling toward the camera. He called his wife over and quietly turned the screen toward her. Side by side, they compared that photo with her own childhood pictures. The same eyes, the same shape of her nose, the same soft curve of her smile. Even the tiny birthmark lined up perfectly. That's you, her husband whispered. For the first time, Melanie had no words. The next morning, she wrote back to Jeffrey. Her tone was cautious but sincere. I don't know what to think, she said. But I saw the pictures. Maybe we should talk. From that moment, things moved quickly. With Sheila's help, both sides arranged a formal DNA test through a certified lab, quietly, without media attention. Within days, the results came back. A 99.999% genetic match between Melanie Walden and her biological parents, Jeffrey and Alta Apantenko. For Alta, the confirmation didn't come like a rush of joy. It came like a wave she had seen forming for 50 years. They said, "We found her," she recalled later. And I just sat there. After 51 years, I didn't know how to react. After decades of praying, pleading, and believing against all reason, the truth had finally found her. The reunion was set for Thanksgiving Day, November 24th, 2022, at a relative's home in Fort Worth, Texas. The timing felt like something out of a storybook. A holiday built on gratitude and togetherness was about to close one of the longest separations in modern American history. As Melanie, still reeling from the discovery of her true identity, stepped through the doorway, the room fell completely silent. No introductions were needed. Across the room, Alta froze. Her hands trembled. Her voice cracked to a whisper. "That's my baby?" In that instant, 51 years of grief dissolved into a single, breathless moment. There were no speeches, no planned words, just the sound of quiet sobs and the soft rustle of a hug that seemed to bridge half a century. Mother and daughter clung to each other, crying, laughing, unable to let go. It wasn't dramatic. It was pure human recognition. Photographs from that day captured something that words never could. 3 generations standing together for the first time. A mother, her long-lost daughter, and the grandchildren she never knew she had. 2 days later, on November 26th, the family gathered again, this time inside a small church in Fort Worth. There, under the warm light of stained glass, Alta and Jeffrey held their daughter's hands for the first time in public, surrounded by relatives, neighbors, and local reporters who had followed the story for years. Alta's voice shook as she spoke. I thought I would never see her again. Jeffrey, usually reserved, could barely find words. He just kept repeating, through tears, 51 years! 51 years! For Melissa, still getting used to her name, the moment felt both joyous and surreal. She had lived an entire lifetime under another name, another story, another truth. It's overwhelming, she told a reporter quietly. My heart is full and broken at the same time. But I'm happy. Really, really happy. The reunion spread across the country like wildfire. From the New York Times to BBC News, the headlines called it a modern miracle of DNA technology. On social media, the story went viral under one simple phrase: DNA wins. But for those who lived it, the miracle wasn't in the science. It was in the persistence. The database match existed only because one family refused to stop searching, even when the world told them to give up. In interviews after the reunion, Lisa Jo Sheely, the scientist who helped interpret the data, put it best. This wasn't solved by law enforcement. It was solved by love, patience, and a little bit of science. A father uploads his DNA, and a mystery older than the internet unravels in days. Months later, in May 2023, the Fort Worth Police Department officially verified the findings through its own lab. Their statement was short but historic. The individual known as Melanie Walden has been confirmed through DNA analysis as Melissa Suzanne Highsmith, reported missing in 1971. This case represents one of the longest successful recoveries of a missing person in Texas history. After the confirmation, the Highsmiths began the long, delicate process of rebuilding what had been stolen. Not just time, but connection. There were decades to catch up on, stories to share, wounds to heal. But the hardest part, finding her, was finally over. For Alta, the reunion closed a half-century of unanswered prayers. "People told me to move on," she said. "But how can a mother move on when she doesn't know what happened to her child?" For Jeffrey, it validated every sleepless night, every cold lead, every letter written and DNA test mailed. 51 years of searching, he said, and it took one little piece of DNA to bring her back. And for Melissa, now stepping into her real name for the first time, the moment wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. She smiled through tears and said softly, "I finally know who I am." In the official records, the ending was little more than a line of text. Under the original file number, the case summary read simply, "Subject located, case closed." But for those who had lived it, the story didn't end there. It was not closure. It was beginning, delayed by 51 long years. And at the heart of it all was a simple truth. Science had finally caught up to hope. A single email, match found, had rewritten half a century of history. For 51 years, Melissa Highsmith had lived under another name, in another life, less than 20 minutes from where she was taken. The distance between her two worlds was small enough to cross in a single drive, yet immeasurable in every other way. As she began to piece her past together, fragments of memory took on new meaning. The small oddities of her childhood, the secrecy, the isolation, the fear, suddenly made sense. What she once thought was strict parenting had been something else entirely, a lifetime spent hiding a crime. Her early years as Melanie Walden were defined by silence and control. The woman who raised her, the same woman Melissa would later identify as her abductor, dictated every detail of her life. Melissa wasn't allowed to play with neighborhood children. She couldn't attend birthday parties or sleepovers. Days would pass with her locked indoors, told she was too fragile to be outside. When she asked why, the woman's answer never changed. "You were born at home. You have brain damage. The world could hurt you." It was a lie, one that built a cage around her childhood and kept her dependent on the very person who had stolen her. "I used to wonder why she even kept me if she didn't want me," Melissa would later say. "I just thought I was a burden." Love was conditional. Punishment was constant. She learned that silence was safety, and questions only brought pain. Without friends or extended family, Melissa grew up in a world with only one truth, the one her captor created. "I thought I was born to the wrong person," she said quietly, "but I didn't know how to explain that feeling." By 15, the walls around her began to crack. The restrictions became unbearable. One afternoon, without planning it, she ran away. "I didn't have anywhere to go," she said. but I knew I couldn't stay. The years that followed were chaotic and unkind. She lived on the streets, drifted through shelters, and took whatever jobs she could find. Sometimes, she said later, I just did what I had to do to survive. By 19, she had 3 children. By 20, she had lost them, a repeating echo of her own stolen beginnings. It wasn't until decades later, after the DNA results and the reunion, that Melissa finally confronted the woman who had raised her. They hadn't spoken in years, but she needed answers. Through a brief online exchange, she asked the question that had haunted her since childhood. Who am I, really? The woman's reply was chillingly casual. I knew you were that baby, she wrote, referring to the missing child on the news back in 1971. When pressed for details, she offered an explanation that raised more questions than it answered. She claimed she had bought Melissa from another woman in 1972 for $500, supposedly because the child's mother couldn't care for her. She insisted it wasn't kidnapping. It was, she said, a private arrangement. Melissa didn't believe her. In my heart, she said, I don't think she bought me. I think she took me. There was no way to verify the claim. Before investigators could question her, the woman died, leaving behind only contradictions and silence. Detectives who reviewed the case later agreed the story didn't fit. There was no record of any informal adoption, no witnesses, no money trail. And the details, the white gloves, the scarf, the bonnet, matched one thing only: a planned abduction. For Melissa, the revelation was devastating but clarifying. It allowed her to look back at her life and finally understand it. I get it now, she said. I understand why I was kept away from everyone. Because if anyone had looked too closely, they would have known I didn't belong there. That realization became both her heartbreak and her freedom. The truth had taken 51 years to surface, but it had finally arrived, undeniable and complete. And somewhere inside the quiet of that truth was a message for every parent, every detective, every person who had ever kept hope alive against impossible odds. Sometimes, faith just has to wait for science to catch up. Even after uncovering her true identity, Melissa found that joy and confusion often walked hand in hand. Meeting her biological family filled her with love, but also with a strange kind of grief. The memories she had were not of her parents, but of the woman who had stolen her from them. It's like I lived someone else's life, she said quietly, and now I have to learn my own. Her name, her history, even her childhood home, all of it had been an invention. Psychologists who studied her case described it as a form of prolonged identity deprivation, where a person adapts so completely to a false reality that it becomes indistinguishable from truth. Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, a leading expert on memory, once called it living amnesia, not because memories vanish, but because they were never allowed to form in the first place. Melissa's story fit that description perfectly. Her abduction had not only taken her from her family, it had stolen her right to remember who she was. After the reunion, Melissa began therapy to untangle decades of confusion and silence. She also reached out to her 3 grown children, who had lived their entire lives believing their mother's early years were ordinary. They were shocked, she said. Everything they thought they knew about our family changed overnight. The process of reclaiming her identity became both legal and deeply symbolic. In May 2023, standing beside her biological parents in a Tarrant County courtroom, Melissa formally changed her name back to Melissa Suzanne Highsmith. As the judge signed the order, the courtroom erupted in applause. Reporters, relatives, and strangers united in the same quiet awe. For Melissa, it wasn't just paperwork. It was restoration, a piece of truth returned to its rightful place. The moment didn't erase the pain, but it marked a turning point, the day she took back what had been stolen, her name, her story, and her sense of self. Still, beneath the relief, there lingered a quiet ache. Not rage, exactly, but the haunting question of how it could have all gone unnoticed. I grew up just a few miles away, she said. All that time we were so close. How could no one see? There was no satisfying answer. It was a reminder of the limits of the world before the digital age, a time when paper records vanished easily and a stranger could walk into an apartment, take a child, and disappear. In 1971, a kidnapper had slipped through every crack in the system. In 2022, a single strand of DNA had bridged 51 years of silence. For Melissa, that contrast defined the paradox of her life. DNA won, she said simply, echoing the phrase that had become her story's headline. But it took 51 years for it to find me. After the reunion, the Highsmith family decided their story couldn't just end as a viral headline or a miracle case. They turned it into a message and a mission. In interviews, Jeffrey, Alta, and Melissa's siblings repeated the same phrase that had carried them through 5 decades of heartbreak. Never give up, follow every lead, believe in science, and believe in family. Those words spread across social media and support groups, resonating with families who were still searching for their missing loved ones. The Highsmiths, once an ordinary family swallowed by an extraordinary tragedy, became advocates for what they called the new way of searching. They transformed their Facebook page, Finding Melissa Highsmith, from a personal campaign into a community hub, a digital lighthouse for others navigating the same dark waters of loss. Because their story wasn't just about one missing child found after half a century. It was about faith that refused to die, and the quiet power of science to bring that faith home. The Finding Melissa Highsmith page soon became more than a memorial or a story of survival. It evolved into a movement. What began as one family's digital bulletin board turned into a forum for DNA tracing and genealogical discovery, where volunteers and amateur researchers came together to share what they had learned. Parents searching for abducted children, adoptees trying to find their birth families, and people seeking answers to lifelong questions began reaching out. Messages poured in from across the United States and beyond. Some wanted to know how to upload raw DNA data from consumer kits like 23andMe or Ancestry.com. Others asked how to interpret confusing genetic matches or how to contact professional genealogists. The Highsmiths, now fluent in a process that had once seemed impossibly technical, began responding personally. "We can't solve every case," Melissa wrote in one post, "but we can help people understand the tools that might." What had started as one family's private grief had transformed into something bigger, a grassroots network of information and hope. Beneath a photo of the reunited family, one comment summed it up best. "Your story gave me the courage to test my DNA. Thank you for showing us it's never too late." The impact rippled far beyond Texas. Within weeks of the reunion, major news outlets across America picked up the story. The Washington Post, the New York Times, People, CNN, each framing it as a symbol of what persistence and modern science could accomplish together. Each publication told a different version of the same truth, that the Highsmith case wasn't solved by luck, but by love, data, and determination. CNN called it a triumph of determination and DNA. The New York Times described it as one of the longest-running missing child cases ever solved through consumer testing. And the Washington Post captured the emotional heart of it, calling it a Thanksgiving miracle rooted in data. The phrase, "DNA wins," first coined by the family themselves, spread across social media as a rallying cry for others still searching. It became shorthand for the quiet revolutions happening in living rooms, genealogy sites, and lab databases across the country. Public fascination with the case reignited debate too. Commentators pointed out that a mystery which had baffled police for half a century was solved in just weeks by ordinary citizens. Not detectives, but a father with a testing kit and unshakable faith. The Highsmith case became a touchstone in national discussions about the future of forensic genealogy and the balance between personal privacy and public justice. Lawmakers, scientists, and ethicists began asking new questions about how far DNA technology could or should reach. But while those debates played out in courtrooms and think tanks, the Highsmith family stayed focused on what they could control: helping people find each other. Melissa, now in her 50s, began speaking publicly at small community events and online forums about identity recovery, trauma, and resilience. Her message wasn't polished or poetic. It was honest. "I lost 51 years," she told one interviewer. "That time doesn't come back. But if my story helps someone else find their family, that's what matters." By the winter of 2022, the story of Melissa Highsmith had moved beyond Fort Worth. It became part of America's collective memory, a tale retold around Thanksgiving tables and in classrooms, a living reminder that even the coldest mysteries can thaw when love refuses to give up. It was called a Thanksgiving miracle, a moment of light in years overshadowed by darker headlines. Television programs, documentaries, and podcasts revisited the case, not as another tragedy, but as a testament to endurance, faith, and the quiet revolution of DNA. In 2023, researchers at a National Forensic Science Conference cited the Highsmith case as a turning point, proof that open-source DNA databases could work hand-in-hand with traditional law enforcement, especially in under-resourced departments. Soon after, several agencies began pilot programs to train officers in reading genealogical matches and coordinating with families leading their own searches. The ripple effect spread even further. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children launched a new collaboration with private DNA companies, directly referencing the Highsmith recovery as the spark. "It changed how we think about cold cases," one NCMEC official said. "Families aren't just waiting anymore. They're investigating." For the Highsmiths, their mission became less about advocacy and more about legacy. They saw their journey as living proof that faith and technology could coexist. That belief in miracles didn't have to mean turning away from science. Their daughter's return was both a spiritual answer and a scientific triumph. By the end of 2023, the Finding Melissa Highsmith project had helped connect more than 30 families with missing relatives through genetic tracing. Some found partial matches, a few achieved full reunions. Each success became another spark in a growing constellation of hope, proof that even the coldest mysteries can thaw under persistence, patience, and science. Looking back, Jeffrey summed it up with quiet, almost reverent clarity. "For 51 years, we were looking in the wrong places. Now we tell people, look everywhere, but don't forget to look close." Alta, now in her 70s, spoke less often to reporters. She preferred quiet mornings with her reunited family. Birthdays, dinners, the kind of moments she had once only dreamed of. But when asked what she hoped others would take from her story, her answer was simple and resolute. "Don't stop believing, and don't wait for someone else to find them. You can be the one." For the American public, the story of Melissa Highsmith remains both a miracle and a mirror. A reminder that the answers to even the longest mysteries may not lie in luck or distance, but in the stubborn, quiet act of refusing to give up. And maybe that's the real lesson of it all, that in a world full of loss, technology can light a path, but it's the human heart that keeps it burning. If you believe in second chances, in science, and in stories that prove miracles still exist, follow this channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and stay with us. Because every story like this reminds us, sometimes the truth isn't lost. It's just waiting to be found. 51 years. That's how long it took for science to find what faith refused to forget. A mother's prayer, a father's search, a daughter's truth. All brought together by a single strand of DNA. Melissa Highsmith's story isn't just a miracle. It's a reminder that even in the darkest chapters, there's always a light waiting to be found. If you believe in second chances, in love that never gives up, and in the power of technology to heal old wounds, share this story, leave a comment, and subscribe for more true stories that prove miracles still happen. Because somewhere out there, another family is still waiting. And maybe, just maybe, the next email that says, "Match found," will be theirs.